Well, hello again, American history, and this chapter now, chapter 17, this is week 3, is the South and the West transformed. And what they're talking about now is after the Civil War, how the South and the West are transformed. There's two big themes in this chapter, and I hate that they cover both these themes in the same chapter, because really I wish they were separate. There's so much going on here. First of all, the South transformed after the Civil War. A big part of this we talked about a little bit last week is the failure of Reconstruction and what white Southerners would call redemption. And by redemption is the very same people who had committed treason, taken up war against their country in the Civil War. Oftentimes the exact same people are back in power. If you can imagine, the year is 1861, and the South, many of the southern states had seceded, and in Washington, D.C., some of those representatives and senators, all of them, except for one, I won't get into that, they closed up their office in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Capitol, and they moved back to their states and said, we're leaving. We're not part of this country anymore, effectively committing treason. They fight a war. Only 750,000 people are killed, that's all. And for a while they had Reconstruction where African Americans could vote and got the rights of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but after 1877, in the Compromise of 1877, those same people get back into power, and in some cases they go back to Washington, D.C. You can imagine if you were someone who stayed there during that time, and you're like, what are you doing here? You committed treason, you left, and now you're back. And like, yeah, we're back. And by the way, the former slaves, they're still enslaved. Slavery by another name. And then they build this myth we call the Lost Cause. This myth that the war was this noble effort, and they start putting up statues everywhere, and that the lost cause, well, we just lost the war, but our cause for states' rights, our cause for freedom, we were fighting for freedom. It was just. We just lost the war because they had more men and more money and more weapons, but our cause was just because we were fighting for freedom. Not to mention, or failing to mention, about the denial of freedom of 4 million people who then after the war would be kept in virtual slavery, would be kept from voting, and would be denied equality that was promised to them. It's a sad, sad history. I wish I could spend more time on that, but I can't. We're going to come back to it, I hope. I've got some videos and things later, because they even talk about lynching, terror that is used in order to keep African Americans oppressed. I'm going to get into that later, I promise. I'm going to make sure we do, because it's so important. But then the other part of this chapter is the Trans-Mississippi West, okay? And you may remember from history class a long time ago something called Manifest Destiny. And this is the idea that God had ordained Americans to spread from sea to shining sea, to spread their culture, specifically Protestantism, not Catholicism, because those are Mexican and we need to get rid of them, and that was before the Civil War. Well, they made it to California. California's a state, Oregon's a state, even before the Civil War is over, but there's this vast interior that needs to be settled, and what makes that possible is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed, I think, in 1869, right after the Civil War. And now the filling in of the West can begin. Oh, we forgot. There's people there, but they're just natives, right? And we can do as we need because they're just standing in the way of progress. And thus begins what's called the Indian Wars, because they're going to resist. We're talking about the Plains Indians, we're talking about the Lakota, the Comanche, also talking about the Apache, the Navajo. It is their Trail of Tears. The Navajo has what's called the Long Walk. I'm not sure if that's in your text or not. It is the equivalent of what happened to the Choctaw and the Cherokees prior to the Civil War. Now is going to happen to them. And so the U.S. military is going to go out seeking the Native Americans so that they can dispossess them of those lands and put them onto reservations. But of course, the natives are going to do what they can to resist this. There's extreme racism in this. The only good Indian is a dead Indian, was a common refrain from the day. And then there's also a genocide, if not an outright genocide or ethnic cleansing. It's an ethnic cleansing of the West for sure. By that, we need to remove these people and replace them. But it's also a cultural genocide. The Dawes Act will try to ensure that they don't speak those languages. They're sent off to the Carlisle School and other schools so that their children are taken from them and then punished if they speak their native languages, if they worship their native religions. So it's a cultural genocide. And it all culminates in a tragic ending of sorts at a place called Wounded Knee, which is what your video is about. So I have two videos in the discussion this week. One, Slavery by Another Name, talks about what's happening with the African Americans in the South and how much of what was supposed to have changed because of the Civil War does not. And then the other one is called The Ghost Dance, and it's about the tragedy at Wounded Knee. I say it's the end, but it's not the end. For one thing, for African Americans, the promise of equality and the promise of ending the discrimination, and often, yes, systemic discrimination, is still being fought, is still being worked on. And for Native Americans too. So often people look at them as being in the past and that they're not here anymore. And that's far from the truth. And that story is far from over as well. And in Oklahoma, we should know that better than in most areas. And so this is those stories that still reverberate to this very day. And it's a fascinating chapter. And if you want to understand why there is systemic inequality in this country today among minorities, you must understand what happened at this time, because those things reverberate all the way through today. So I hope you enjoy it. The videos are really good. The reflective paragraphs that you write, as I've mentioned, I want your thoughts. I don't just recap what you watched. I've watched it. I don't want to read about it again. I want to read what you think about it. And I want you to read what you think about what happened during this time period based on what you read from the textbook. Those are the paragraphs, assuming that your grammar and punctuation is good. Those are the paragraphs that'll score well. The paragraphs that just recite what was in there, or the paragraphs that look like they just were Googled, will not score well. Best of luck. If you find it interesting and it stimulates your mind, that'll be reflected when you do your writing. And that, for me as a teacher, is what I'm looking for, because then I'm like, yes, they got it. All right, have a good week, and I'll post another video next week.